A vital aspect in understanding the human past through the field of archaeology is to consider how humans have interacted with and adapted to the environment in which they lived. Changes in the environment will often help us to understand changes in prehistoric strategies. It is important to note that while environmental change does have an impact on a society, it does not necessarily mean that it determines societal changes. This concept was described by Richard Jeffries in his book, Holocene Hunter-Gatherers in the Lower Ohio River Valley. In reference to prehistoric populations, Jeffries states, "Today, most people would agree that the environment did not determine the nature of these societies. However, the distribution of the region's natural resources did influence where people lived, what they did there, and how long they stayed." In this video, we will be looking at how climate change during the Archaic period influenced prehistoric human life in North America based on changing resource availability. More specifically, we will consider a period of relatively warmer and drier climate known as the hypsithermal interval, and the impact that this environmental change had in and around the Midwestern region. To do so, we will have the help of an archaeology professor.
I'm Richard Yerkes, Department of Anthropology, Ohio State University.
First, it is important to understand the landscape and environment of the region prior to the change, as well as the strategies that humans were using for settlement patterns and resource exploitation. In the study of archaeology, North America is divided by multiple culture areas. A culture area is defined as geographic regions within which ethnic groups share similar culture traits. In North America, there are about 10 recognized culture areas. The focus for this video will be in the Midwest and Great Lakes, but we will consider what is going on nearby as well. Across the continent, archaeologists have varying regional timelines following different classification systems. For the purpose of this video, we will be referring to the Midwestern taxonomic system. Following the pre-Clovis and Paleo-Indian periods is the Archaic, which is broken up into 3 subperiods: the Early Archaic from 10 to 8,000 BP, the Middle Archaic from 8 to 5,000 BP, and the Late Archaic from 5 to 3,000 BP. The Archaic is then followed by the Early Woodland period. The period of climate change, known as the hypsithermal, took place during the Middle Archaic, beginning around 9,000 BP. It is important to note, though, that the hypsithermal was a regional change and did not begin at the same time in all areas. The change brought on by the period began in the northwest and spread east over time. Also, it had a variety of effects on diverse ecosystems, even those within a single culture area. Research done at Jackson Pond in Kentucky has revealed prehistoric environmental information related to the Lower Ohio Valley and is used as an indicator for most of the Midwest. Prior to the Early Archaic, the Midwest was primarily dominated by boreal forests, mostly spruce and pine. In the Early Archaic, the region experienced changes in vegetation as the Wisconsin ice sheet in the north retreated. The climate was cool and moist, and forests filled with mesic, open-canopied deciduous trees. Populations through this time were primarily highly mobile foragers. During the Early Archaic, throughout the Midwest, including sites in Missouri, Indiana, and Ohio, large-bodied deer are a prominent resource. Elk, box turtle, and smaller mammals are also found on the archaeological record. Plant resources, such as nuts, are found to be exploited to some degree, but without groundstone tools, there is not evidence of high levels of nut processing in most areas. There is also not a strong record of aquatic resources. The riverine environment at the time consisted of many braided streams and rivers of high intensity. This cool period, where high mobility was favored, transformed with the onset of the hypsithermal from the west. So what exactly is the hypsithermal?
It's called the Atlantic period, the altithermal, and the hypsithermal. And sort of in general, it's kind of like, after the Ice Age, things got warmer, but it kind of overshot the present in the sense that conditions got much warmer than today and drier, particularly like out to the west on the Great Plains. So there seems to be a lot of evidence for the expansion of the prairies across Mississippi all the way up to northwestern Ohio.
As Dr. Yerkes described, increased warm and dry conditions hit the Great Plains and expanded the Prairie Peninsula as far as Ohio. Evidence of this change is found through different components of the archaeological record. First, we begin to see prairie plant species in the Middle Archaic in areas that do not express evidence of grasslands prior to this period. An example of this includes the findings of emergent grass pollen and prairie clover in the Lower Ohio Valley. We can also look at faunal remains and consider changes in the record that may have been influenced by climate. For example, in southern Illinois, researchers have found evidence of plains pocket gophers during the Middle Archaic. Also, in central Missouri, archaeologists have found a rising abundance of cottontail rabbits. Both of these animals are known to live in grasslands habitat and seem to emerge on the record during this period, which suggests a changing environment. The hydrology of the environment was another important change. There was a shift from the high-velocity braided streams and rivers known in the early Archaic to low-energy meandering rivers. Floodplains were stabilized, and lake and swamp habitats ideal for shellfish were formed. More openings were created in forests where, in areas such as Ohio, evidence of non-arboreal plants became more prominent. In some areas, forest was restricted along the riverbeds as the plains took over. Dry, deciduous trees filled in the region south of the Great Lakes. Abundance of elm and beech trees decreased, while oak hickory forests filled in.
There were, like I said, lakes in Minnesota are thought to have dried up at this time, and the forests were kind of retreating, and the grasslands were expanding. So it's thought that even some plains groups during the Archaic period, that are in the Middle Archaic and also the Middle Holocene, move further eastward, and you find some projectile points or spear points that are typical of the plains over much further east than normal. And there's a debate about whether whether bison herds also crossed, or whether they just moved into new areas and hunted deer and stuff like that. So it seems it affected people more in the center of North America and the Great Plains, and rather than in the eastern woodlands, where it wasn't as intense and intensely dry.
Overall, in the Midwest, there is evidence of more generalized faunal resources. Steve Wolverton, author of The Effects of the Hypsithermal on Prehistoric Foraging Efficiency in Missouri, argues that the more generalized hunt for smaller, faster prey is the result of the environment depleting preferred resources, such as those with bigger bodies, including white-tailed deer, or those that are slower and thus easier to catch, such as box turtle. It is argued that the more generalized hunting strategy is related to the grassland expansion. In addition to changes in the mammalian record, archaeologists at various sites are finding more aquatic remains, including fish, shellfish, and aquatic birds. These resources are beginning to be exploited to the point that we even start to see shelled middens in the south during the Middle Archaic. As mentioned before, the warming and drying changed the layout of water resources. Rivers became meandering and low intensity with stable floodplains. This, coupled with the retraction of forests closer to rivers in some areas, are possible influences for increasing seasonal settlements near the river basins. During this time, archaeologists are finding that people are adapting to a less mobile collector strategy. Seasonal nut resources are becoming highly exploited as groundstone tools for processing are showing up on the archaeological record. Findings of more stratified settlements have helped archaeologists better understand some of the transitions of this time. Settlements such as the Davison farm site along the Ohio River show evidence of long-term seasonal occupation. The effects of the hypsithermal do not seem to appear in this area until later, closer to the beginning of the late Archaic. But at the same time, we are beginning to see intense occupation of this site. We find exploitation of seasonal nuts, which include hickory, black walnut, hazelnut, and acorn, as well as fish and shellfish, and non-arboreal wild plants, which are showing up in larger quantities than before. We are noticing emerging change in settlement strategy as populations are becoming less mobile and more dependent on local seasonal resources. Even for stone tools, populations are exploiting the nearby resources, even if lower quality, and processing a wide range of tools at the base camps. At the Davison farm site, permanent structures including underground ovens are found for the first time in the area. These appear to have been used for nut roasting, which could then be stored and used as a food source throughout the winter in other camp locations. Deeper into the late Archaic, cultivated squash rinds are found, perhaps the beginnings of the road toward plant domestication, which soon after includes marsh elder and sunflower. The enriched floodplains and migration of seed plants during the Middle Archaic may have had an influence on this future transition.
In the book by Jeffries, there's some nice maps of, for the lower Ohio Valley of distribution of early Archaic, Middle Archaic, and late Archaic sites. And if you look at those, all in the same, all together, it doesn't look like there's a whole lot of change. Like you would kind of think that maybe if the Ohio Valley got drier, people would move out of the Ohio Valley and maybe either move up into the mountains in the south or further north toward the lakes. And they don't seem to have done that. It seems like the sites are kind of in the same places throughout the Middle Holocene. So that's one place where it doesn't look like there was much of an effect on them too. Now people have tried to do like tree ring studies in the Ohio Valley to see if they could find any evidence of drought or dryness, but it's hard because a lot of the trees have deep roots, and they're not as affected or as sensitive to drought maybe as western trees and stuff. So anyway, I mean, to my knowledge, I don't see much evidence that the people were affected by drought. Like what Jeffrey says, which I think is correct, is that you can say that the time of the hypsithermal was a time of adjustment, but it's mostly that the landscape began to look more like it does today, in the sense that the rivers formed their current configurations, and the plants and animals kind of took on their more or less same distribution. It'd be fishing conditions might have improved, and so on, and floodplains may become more richer in terms of wild plants and wild animals. So it seems like a pretty good time in the Ohio Valley. But again, it's hard to say if there were a whole lot of people that moved into the Ohio Valley from the west, and I'm not as familiar with the archaeology of that period to say for sure if you can make that argument. It just kind of seems more like the people that were already there kind of continue to prosper as hunter-gatherers.
It is important to be careful and critical when making assumptions about the past. There are still questions to be researched, and as Dr. Yerkes described in reference to tree ring analysis, a lot of the answers are difficult to find. But we can consider what we do understand about the hypsithermal and work it into our understanding of the environment and thus human adaptation. We see that the hypsithermal transformed the landscape all over. While in the Great Plains, this transformation was more intense, thus seeming to promote a direct change for human populations. We find that in the Midwest and eastward, the change in the landscape is providing for a more transitional period, where people seem to adapt by changing settlement strategies within the region. What we can think about is how the transitioning period influenced larger societal changes in later periods, such as mound building and agriculture, and what role the climate change known as the hypsithermal interval played in these transformations.